Greetings, dear viewer. Welcome to the channel. This channel is dedicated to those who value traditional family principles and disapprove of adultery. Make sure to subscribe and join us as we delve into today's story. George Garcia once believed his life was perfect. His wife, Patricia, seemed to embody all his dreams. Beautiful, intelligent, and, as he thought, entirely devoted to him. They had met in college, both focused on their studies. George was working towards a degree in engineering, while Patricia was on track to become a lawyer. However, fate brought them together in a creative writing class, one neither of them had originally chosen. Their last names, Anderson and Garcia, placed them next to each other by chance, and it was here that George first noticed Patricia's charm. Despite not being the most attractive guy on campus, George didn't care. It didn't matter. They clicked instantly, sharing jokes and laughter amidst the rigid atmosphere of their academic environment. What started as casual conversations in class soon developed into meetings outside of it, and before long, friendship blossomed into something more. Their relationship provided both of them with relief from the pressures of college life. Their bond was filled with joy, laughter, and undeniable physical chemistry. One evening, in the middle of the semester, a simple dinner and movie unexpectedly turned into an unforgettable night. George walked Patricia home, intending to say goodbye, but a simple kiss led to another, and by the morning, George found himself in Patricia's bed. From that moment on, their relationship grew even stronger. By the start of the next semester, they were entirely devoted to one another. Between their intense studies and budding romance, there was barely time for anything else. As time passed, they introduced each other to their families. Patricia joined George's family for Thanksgiving, while George spent Easter with Patricia's family. For Christmas, they decided to stay on campus, enjoying the solitude in each other's company. Their families fully approved of their relationship, and when graduation approached, it came as no surprise when George proposed to Patricia, and she immediately accepted. Both felt their relationship was something truly special, and neither was ready to let it slip away. After college, they transitioned into their careers effortlessly. George secured a job with a construction company that appreciated his hands-on approach to engineering, while Patricia began her career at a prominent law firm. Their demanding jobs left little free time, but they always made room for each other, whether it was vacations, busy weekends, or passionate nights. Time flew by, and before long, 7 years had passed. As their wedding anniversary approached, George began to think about their future. He envisioned them starting a family, buying a house, and building something more permanent than their current apartment. Financially, they were both doing well, and George felt it was the right time to plan for the next phase of their lives. However, Patricia didn't share his vision. Strangely, they had never discussed their future beyond the wedding. They never argued, and Patricia seemed perfectly content with their life. She saw no reason to change anything. Maybe one day, she would be ready for more, but at that moment, she was happy with how things were. A few days before their anniversary, George was in the kitchen making dinner, a routine he had developed since he finished work earlier than Patricia. He was in the middle of cooking when Patricia came home, and without warning, dropped a bombshell that changed everything. "I have a date this Friday," Patricia said calmly as she walked into the house. George froze, unable to process what he had just heard. Surely, he must have misunderstood. He asked her to repeat herself, and she did, with the same calm tone. She had agreed to go on a date with a man named Connor, casually adding the affectionate nickname Con as if it were the most normal thing in the world. At that moment, George's world collapsed. Shock turned into a flood of questions. "Why are you unhappy? Have you been cheating on me? Do you want a divorce?" His mind raced, searching for answers. How could this have happened? Who was Connor? What had he missed? Their relationship, especially their intimate life, had seemed so solid. Patricia, seemingly unaffected, answered with a chilling calmness. "It's simple," she said, as if explaining something obvious. "I get attention all the time, even when we're together. You've seen it throughout school and university. Dating was never my focus. All my time and energy went into studying and earning my degree. But lately, you've been pushing me more and more toward the idea of settling down, buying a house, and starting a family. So I thought, why not try dating? Besides, there's this incredibly attractive guy who's been flirting with me. He's probably the most handsome guy who's ever shown interest in me. George froze, stunned. Well, thank you, he muttered bitterly, his voice laced with sarcasm. What a great boost to my self-esteem. And what about us? Are you just going to toss me aside like an old toy? Oh, George, come on, Patricia replied. You know you're handsome, and I love you. It's just something fun I want to try. It's not like it's serious. George's anger started to boil inside him. I absolutely disagree, he snapped. I think you shouldn't be dating other men. It'll destroy everything we've built. Patricia rolled her eyes and sighed heavily. George, I didn't realize you were so dramatic. You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's just one date, nothing special. Not willing to let her belittle him, George responded, Fine. If it's such a minor thing, then I'll go on a date, too. Patricia burst out laughing. You? On a date? She laughed incredulously. You're kidding, right? You couldn't find a date by Friday if your life depended on it. Her laughter grew louder, filled with condescension. Look, it's easy for women to get dates, even if they're not supermodels. But for men, especially those who aren't drop-dead gorgeous, it takes effort. You're sweet, George, but attractive? Not exactly. Her laughter echoed through the room, and George felt his patience snap. He couldn't believe she was mocking him like this. First, she announced she was going on a date, and now she was humiliating him by saying he could never do the same. Her relentless laughter was the final straw, like a knife twisting in an open wound. He couldn't take it anymore. Instead of lashing out, George made a choice. He needed to leave before things went too far. Patricia, I'm too angry to think clearly right now. You blindsided me, and now you're laughing at me, he said. Without another word, he stormed out of the house, heading to his friend Robert's place. Robert had been his closest friend for years. They played video games together, drank together, and understood each other without needing many words. That evening was no different. George didn't explain why he was there, and Robert didn't ask. That was the nature of their friendship. The next morning, George arrived at work with a pounding headache, a bit late for the first time in his life. Megan, the office administrator, immediately noticed something was off. She had always had a soft spot for George, but chose not to say anything. His boss, if he noticed, said nothing either. George was reliable, so no one made a fuss over one bad day. That evening, when George returned home, he didn't want to make dinner for both of them, but out of habit, he did anyway. Patricia came in at her usual time and, as expected, couldn't resist another jab. Back from your little temper tantrum? She mocked, a smug smile on her face. Any updates? Still planning on finding yourself a date by Friday. Her words dripped with arrogance. George looked at her, barely recognizing the woman standing before him. When had everything gone so wrong? Where had the love and joy in their marriage gone? In a calm but firm tone, George repeated, Patricia, if you go on this date, it will destroy us. And I'm serious. If you don't cancel it. He had braced himself for yet another dismissive response, but Patricia's words struck him like a sharp blade. Oh, really? She sneered. And who exactly are you planning to go on a date with? Megan from your office? She's old enough to be your mother, weighs as much as a hippo, and is married to a man who'd probably kill you if you even looked at her. There's no one else at your office. So who are you really going to date? Maybe you'll ask one of the guys out. Yeah, that'll go over really well. George's thoughts spiraled. Robert was the last man left at work, and George suspected he might be in a relationship. So, if Robert wasn't into both genders, George's luck had clearly run out. His options were few. Maybe it was time to hire an escort. After all, paying for companionship wasn't cheating, was it? He wondered if Patricia had any idea how her mocking laughter was slowly eating away at his love for her, like acid-corroding steel. Who had she become? Was everything they'd shared just a mask hiding her true nature? George felt drained, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. In silence, he trudged to the bedroom. Later, Patricia came in to find him already asleep, which surprised her. It was usually George who initiated their intimate moments, but tonight, he didn't seem interested. She felt her usual longing, but didn't even consider waking him. Their physical closeness had always been a constant, especially on weekends, and now this sudden distance felt odd. By midweek, Patricia returned home to find George glued to his phone, furiously typing. They had always agreed no phones after work, just time for each other. The food was ready, but George didn't even look up as she entered the room. A sly smile played on Patricia's lips as she crossed her arms. "Try to make me jealous, George," she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "No kiss today? Too busy with your Friday night plans." She continued, her tone sharp. "Who's texting you? Megan? I bet her husband would love to know. Or is it Robert? You two up to something?" Her laughter grew louder, turning into a mocking cackle. Each barb hit George like a knife to the heart, making his feelings wither with every word. He raised his head from his phone, his voice calm but heavy with warning. "Patricia, this has to stop," he said, his words carrying the weight of a deep frustration. "You're destroying us with these jokes and barbs. If this keeps up, I swear, our marriage won't survive." For the first time, Patricia fell silent, her usual mocking grin faltering. She shrugged it off as though it was nothing. "Oh, George, relax." She dismissed him. "It's just one date. You'll survive. I just want to know what it's like to go on a date with someone incredibly attractive. I've never done it, and I'm just curious." George's frustration exploded. "We made vows to each other, Patricia. What we have is supposed to be special, and you're tearing it apart," he snapped, turning away and heading upstairs, leaving her standing in the kitchen alone. The next day, Patricia came home to an empty house. When George arrived later, something about him had changed. His hair was freshly cut, styled in a way he hadn't worn in years, a look that reminded her of when they first met. A pang of unease hit her. Unable to resist, she made a cutting remark. "New haircut for your big night out," she smirked, using air quotes. "I'm sure Robert will appreciate it when you two meet on Friday." George ignored her completely, walking past her and heading to the bedroom. But when he entered the room, what he saw only fueled the fire smoldering inside him. When he returned to the kitchen, Patricia was waiting, that familiar smirk on her face. "I noticed Victoria's secret bag on the dresser," she said innocently, feigning curiosity. "Interesting choice. Did you buy yourself some lingerie for your just a night out? Looks like more than just a meeting." Her words dripped poison. "What kind of lingerie did you pick? Funny, you never wore anything like that on our honeymoon. I remember asking about wedding night lingerie, and you said your body was more than enough for me. And now you're buying this. If it's just a date, I guess he won't even see it right." George's anger flared. He clenched his fists, jaw tight, wanting to explode. But somehow, he managed to hold himself back. The chaos of the last few days had drained him, and he was barely holding on. Patricia, either blissfully unaware or indifferent to the turmoil inside him, continued as though nothing had changed. She smiled lightly to herself. "You've got to be a special kind of person," she mused aloud, "to still be the most attractive guy in the room." George snapped, his patience completely gone. "Oh, how great. My confidence is just fine," he responded sarcastically, but Patricia kept going, oblivious. "It's so important for me to see you in your underwear. And now some random guy gets that pleasure on what you call just a date." George's irritation reached its peak. He shot her a cold, sharp look. "Let's get something straight, Patricia. This has gone too far. If you put something on for me tonight and cancel your date tomorrow, I might be able to get through this. But if you really go on that date, we're done. Patricia giggled, completely ignoring the seriousness in his words. You're always so desperate for intimacy, she waved dismissively. I've waited all week. This is the longest I've gone without it. It's always about you, isn't it? Her voice carried a challenge, daring him to respond. I can do whatever I want, and I don't have to dress a certain way just for you. Patricia snapped, her voice sharp. George's gaze locked onto hers, his expression hardening. He stared at her in silence, his eyes piercing, making her feel uncomfortable under his scrutiny. After what felt like an eternity, George finally spoke, his words cold and final. If you go on that date on Friday, we will never be intimate again. With that, he turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving Patricia alone, her mind racing with the weight of his ultimatum. Friday came, and as promised, George did nothing to prepare dinner. He was already making his own plans, and Patricia could feel the tension rising. When she walked in after work, she was greeted by the sight of him, sharply dressed in a freshly ironed shirt and new trousers. He looked better than usual, and it only intensified her irritation. Their recent lack of intimacy simmered in the background, threatening to boil over. At one point, she considered making the first move, but her pride won out. She wasn't going to be the one to initiate. Instead, she began preparing for her evening, though she noticed something odd in the apartment, something off, but dismissed it. Too focused on her excitement for her date with Ted, she couldn't be bothered to analyze the details. George left without a word, and soon after, Patricia also departed, meeting Ted at a trendy restaurant. The evening was smooth, Ted was charming, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. When dinner ended, Ted suggested continuing the night at his place, and without hesitation, Patricia agreed. She imagined a passionate, exciting night ahead, but the reality didn't match her fantasy. As soon as they entered Ted's apartment, his behavior changed. He shoved her onto the couch and sneered, "Bet you love being easy prey." The word stung, dousing her enthusiasm in an instant. She quickly disengaged, gathering what little dignity she had left. Going home meant admitting defeat, so instead, she headed to her friend Emily's place, spinning a fabricated story about a fight with George. Emily welcomed her, and they spent the night watching romantic comedies and drinking cheap wine, trying to drown their frustrations. The next morning, Patricia woke up with a pounding headache. The hangover was a harsh reminder of the night before. Emily suggested they go shopping to clear their heads, and Patricia, in no rush to go home, agreed. By the time she returned, it was well past dinner. She expected George to be brooding, but when she walked into the apartment, it was empty. The absence of his things hit her hard. His boots weren't by the door. His side of the dresser was cleared out. Patricia stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. She smirked, shaking her head, convinced this was just an overreaction on his part. He'll come crawling back, she muttered to herself. He'll beg for forgiveness, and this will all be forgotten. But by Saturday, her amusement began to fade. George hadn't returned, and there hadn't been a word from him. No call, no message. Her pride kept her from calling his parents or his friend Robert. After all, George had left. If he wanted to come back, he could reach out, but she wasn't going to chase after him. As the second week dragged on, frustration began to build. She couldn't understand where he had gone. She even drove by his workplace, spotting his truck in its usual spot, but George himself was nowhere to be seen. It was slowly starting to dawn on her that she might have caused far more damage than she had realized. Their relationship had always seemed solid to her. How had one casual date turned their world upside down? The more she replayed the events in her mind, the more confused she became. It had been 2 weeks since she casually mentioned her date with Ted. 2 weeks since she walked into the office, blindsided by news of the divorce. The shock still lingered, leaving her unable to fully process it. Divorce over one date? It seemed absurd, ridiculous. Moreover, George had left her a note instructing her to contact his lawyer if she had any questions about the divorce. The nerve! Patricia could hardly believe it. She thought back to their years together. 2 years of dating in school, 7 years of marriage. And now she was being asked to consult a lawyer like some stranger. The thought of George and Robert together suddenly flashed in her mind, unsettling her. Could George really be seeing Robert? Were they planning something even more outrageous? Marriage, perhaps? The thought seemed laughable, and Patricia couldn't help but smirk. What a joke, she muttered to herself. Stuffing the divorce papers into her briefcase, she headed home, convinced this whole thing would blow over. George couldn't possibly be serious. He was just trying to force her into an apology, but she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. But as time went on, the silence began to gnaw at her. She ate dinner alone night after night in their one-shared condo. The emptiness, the silence, was becoming unbearable. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she realized how much she missed George. She had enjoyed his company more than she had been willing to admit. Now that he was gone, the void was overwhelming. A sense of guilt began to stir within her. Maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake, but admitting it was too hard. So, Patricia devised a plan. She needed more information, and the only way to get it was to talk to Robert. She knew where he liked to hang out, so she arranged to run into him. When Robert saw her, his first instinct was to leave. He had always found Patricia intimidating, but she caught him before he could escape. They exchanged strained greetings, the tension between them thick and palpable. Robert knew why she was there, and it made him uneasy. George had told him everything, and Robert had no desire to get involved in Patricia's schemes. In his eyes, she should have been begging George for forgiveness, not playing games. Patricia, with all her legal skills, found herself at a loss. The silence stretched between them until Robert could no longer hold back. "Enough with the games," he snapped, his irritation boiling over. "You're here because you want to know where George is, and you think I'll help you? Well, guess what, Patricia? Screw you." Patricia blinked, startled by the venom in his voice. She still didn't grasp that Robert wasn't going to help her. "Come on, Robert," she tried, smoothing things over. "This is just a misunderstanding. If you tell me where to find him, we can fix everything." Robert had always gone along with Patricia before, swept up by her beauty and charm. But now, seeing her true nature, he felt no obligation to be kind. She didn't care about George, about their marriage. She had proven that with her actions. "Patricia," Robert said with disdain, "we both know you're not here by accident. You came for answers, but I don't have any for you. George warned you, and you threw it all away for a fling. But you laughed in his face, and now you're shocked that he's moving on? Let him go. Enjoy your pretty boys." With that, Robert walked past her without sparing another glance, leaving Patricia frozen, stunned by his words. But soon enough, she shrugged it off. She convinced herself that Robert was just like all the others, a man trying to seduce her, not worthy of her time or attention. Yet, despite her outward confidence, something inside her remained unsettled, gnawing at her. She felt the need to talk to someone, but who? Emily was out of the question. Her friend had once hinted that she dreamed of having a partner like George. Her parents, too, were off limits. They had always admired George. In the end, Patricia did nothing. Time passed. Exactly 4 months later, a court summons arrived, leaving her with no choice but to reluctantly seek help from a divorce attorney at her firm, one who specialized in such matters. After laying out her situation, the attorney advised her to proceed with the divorce. Though Patricia hesitated, clinging to the hope that she could salvage the marriage, a barrage of legal questions soon made her situation clear. "Have you spoken to your husband since he left?" the attorney asked. "No," Patricia replied quietly. "Have you continued seeing Connor or anyone else?" the attorney pressed. "Not Connor," Patricia snapped, her voice hardening. "He turned out to be a selfish jerk. But I have needs too." "Do you really think your husband wants to reconcile?" the attorney asked, her tone gentle but probing. Patricia faltered, doubts creeping in. Maybe she had destroyed something good, but she still held on to the belief that if she spoke to George, they could fix things. In the end, she agreed to meet with him. Reluctantly, she accepted the inevitability of the divorce. However, the attorney was puzzled. Was this really the same Patricia, the one who was supposedly always on the lookout for a new man? Now, she seemed blind to the fact that George had emotionally checked out long ago. There was no chance he'd come back, whether or not there was someone else. Patricia just didn't see it. The day of the meeting arrived, and they met in George's attorney's office. Patricia thought he looked surprisingly good, while George couldn't help but notice how worn out she seemed. It was obvious she hadn't been sleeping, had lost weight, and was under a lot of stress. But despite all of that, Patricia still didn't seem to grasp the full picture. After some polite small talk, Patricia decided to ask him directly, "What does all of this mean, George? I went on one innocent date, and you're blowing it up to the point of filing for divorce?" she demanded. George sighed, clearly tired of the conversation. She really didn't understand. "I warned you, Patricia. I told you this would destroy us." His tone was firm, but calm. "Do you really think that date meant nothing? You didn't even sleep with the guy. What about the lingerie you wore for him? The one you never wore for me? You enjoyed flaunting yourself in front of him, just like you did with the others before him. You humiliated me, made me feel worthless. And I was the one you said you loved." His voice grew slightly louder. "No, Patricia. You've always thought about yourself, what you needed, what you could get. This marriage was never about us. And just so you know," George continued, "that same Friday I went on a date too. It went well. Really well. In fact, I'm planning to marry her as soon as the divorce is finalized. So sign the papers and let me go." George stood up, his words hanging in the air. Without another glance, he walked out, leaving Patricia alone in the office. She sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The full weight of the situation hit her. She had ruined everything, but it was too late now. She had already agreed to the divorce. When it was finalized, she left with half of the assets, including the apartment. Years passed. Patricia dated handsome men, went through failed relationships, and dealt with health issues. It was only after seeing a therapist that she realized the painful truth. She needed to grow up. By then, there were many regrets, but none weighed as heavily as the loss of George, the one man she had truly pushed away. Although she eventually met someone kind and reliable, nothing would ever compare to what she once had with George. This regret would haunt her for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, George's life moved on. He went on that fateful date, and by midweek, he wasn't texting Megan or Robert. He was texting someone else. Megan, one of his colleagues, had never liked Patricia. She was sharp-tongued and quick to judge people. So when George came to work upset after a fight with Patricia, Megan immediately sensed something had happened. Over lunch, George told her the whole story. Megan liked George a lot. He wasn't like the other engineers. He wasn't arrogant or overconfident. It turned out Megan had a daughter, 3 years younger than George. Soon, she gave him her daughter's phone number. That evening, George wasn't texting Megan or Robert. He was texting Megan's daughter, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. George soon learned that Abigail was single and thriving in her stable, well-paid career. Unlike him, she had an infectious smile that could light up any room, and there was no denying that she was very attractive. However, what mattered most to him was that she eagerly agreed to go on a date with him the following Friday. Patricia was no longer a part of this new chapter in his life. Her absence from that date marked the definitive end of their relationship. Abigail felt that George would make a wonderful companion for her, and her intuition proved right. Shortly after George and Patricia's divorce was officially finalized, George married Abigail. Their bond was genuine, built on mutual love, and they lived a happy marriage filled with passion and deep affection, one that lasted forever.